Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the Shimmerz Paints November Color Kitz collection. And before I forget to mention it, when you place an order with Shimmerz Paints and you use my name in the comments, you'll receive a free gift with your order. This layout is my second layout for November using this kit. And for the first layout, I use a stamp to create some images of leaves. And I wanted to try out using actual leaves. Now, I was away at a scrapbooking weekend, and it was at a hotel, and there wasn't a lot of greenery around the hotel, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to find any leaves, but I stepped outside for a few moments and I did see that there was one little area that had some trees. So I gathered up a small selection of leaves and I hurried back inside because it was really cold out. And I found that using the actual leaves was just as easy as using the stamps. I didn't have any tools with me. I was thinking maybe a brayer would work really well to mush down the color, but I didn't need anything other than my paintbrush, my Shimmerz paints, and a couple of leaves. I had a number of leaves left over from the first layout, but for this layout, I wanted to have some leaves that had the green and teal colors that were included in the November kit. And I thought that those would look great in combination with the yellow and orangey leaves that I already had. So you could see here, this is very simple. I applied the paint to the leaves, and I took the leaves and I pressed them down on the paper. So I mentioned this in my last video. At first, I thought that I wanted the color to be very thick and complete, and I didn't want any white space. But then I realized that when I cut those leaves out, the white spaces looked really nice. So I wasn't as concentrated on making impressions that were perfect. I just wanted there to be enough color that you could see that there was a leaf. And then those little areas of white I knew were going to look good when I cut out the leaves. For these leaves, I'm using all of the colors from the November kit. I'm using an Inklingz called Good as Gold. That's that gold color that I'm using now. I love that color, and I used a whole bunch of it to make the leaf impressions, and it's also great for splattering, which I think gold splatters look fantastic, so it was really great for that too. I also used a Vibez called Ocean Water. That's that teal color. And then I use a Twinklingz called Plant One on Me. And that's the greenish color. You could see it to the right of the piece of paper that I'm working on now. And I'm pressing the leaves onto a smooth, thick white cardstock. I didn't want a lot of buckling, although it looks kind of nice when the paper buckles with leaves. It makes it look a little bit more realistic. So there is a little bit of warping of the paper always, I think, when you add mixed media to it. But this is a nice paper to use that's pretty thick, that takes the paint really well. I continued with this process until I had filled up several pieces of paper with leaf impressions. And I found that I especially loved the leaves with the gold, so I made sure that I included gold in a lot of my leaf making. And I thought I was going a little overboard with the number of leaves that I made, but it turned out that I used a huge percentage of these because when I had so many leaves, I was able to layer them and make some cool effects, I think. So when I was done stamping all the leaves, I allowed them to dry, and now I'm fussy cutting all of them out. And I'm not really worried about cutting them out perfectly. I know that leaves look a little bit different. They're different shapes and they could have some irregularities in them. So I decided to just roughly cut them out. And then after I did, I combined them with the other leaves that I had left over from my first project, and any of the leaves that didn't have their edges inked, I inked the edges with some distress ink in Vintage Photo. So none of the bluish leaves or the greenish leaves were inked, but there were also some other leaves that I knew I wasn't going to use and I ended up not inking. So now all of the leaves are inked. And now I'm going to start working on a wreath. I'm going to combine all these leaves and make a wreath. So I didn't have any scrap paper with me, so I had to use a regular sheet of white paper, but that's okay. This is a nice thick paper, and I thought this would be good to use as the basis for my wreath. But then I was thinking that I forgot to add even more gold to the leaves. So I wanted to add lots and lots of gold splatters. So I went back and I got my Good as Gold Inklingz. I added some water to it, and then I began adding lots and lots of gold splatters to the leaves. I love this effect. And I actually love the way the leaves look right there. I love the combination of all of the Shimmerz paints, and I think they look pretty realistic. So here I am adding lots and lots of splatters. And you can see that I have some other leaves off on top of my mat. They wouldn't all fit on there at once. And then after I added lots and lots of gold splatters, then I also added lots of white splatters. And this is watered down white acrylic paint. And I'm just splattering them all over. Getting quite a bit of paint on my mat. This is not the ideal mat to use for mixed media. However, it does clean up pretty well with a little bit of extra effort. But next time I have to remember to bring my glass mat. I always feel like glass is the perfect thing to have underneath mixed media projects because it cleans up so easily. So for this round of leaves, I did the same thing. I added some white splatters. I added some gold splatters. But then I also went back in with the ocean water Vibez and I added some splatters of that because I just thought that it would be nice to have a darker splatter on some of the leaves. And I like the way that this turned out. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what happened, but I do not have footage of me creating the wreath. But I took that circle that I cut out earlier and I just began layering the leaves on top of that circle. And then after I had made a circle of leaves, I went back and I added more leaves both on top and also I tucked some behind in the back just so that there would be a very full wreath. Since I had lots and lots of leaves, I figured I might as well make full use of them and add lots of leaves to this circle. So the wreath goes very close to the edge, kind of at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. So I had to use shorter leaves there, and then I was able to use those 7-point leaves a little more freely in the other areas where there was a little bit more room. I hope that that makes sense. I selected 2 pieces of pattern paper from the kit to use in the background. I gutted the lighter piece. It has a bunch of leaves all over it. I thought that would be perfect. And then I cut down this piece of orange striped paper, probably about 1/2 inch on each side to layer on top of the other pattern paper. And then I inked the edges of the orange pattern paper with some Distress ink and Vintage Photo. I always think that you can't go wrong by inking the edge of the paper where 2 pattern papers meet. And I made some adjustments to the wreath. I feel like I never make a wreath that looks like perfectly symmetrical, but I think that's okay, especially with this kind of a wreath. You don't really expect it to be perfect, or at least I don't. So that's attached down, and now I'm going to start working with my photo. So this is a photo taken on Thanksgiving quite a few years ago in 2017. This is a photo of my nephew, my 2 nieces, and both of my daughters. And it was taken at my sister's house on Thanksgiving Day. So I have the photo matted on some white cardstock. And then I usually will layer the papers together and then put foam underneath all the papers. But I decided to mix it up a little bit, probably not noticeable to anybody else, but I decided that I was going to add the foam and then add the pattern paper mat once the picture was already popped up on the foam. So something a little bit different for me, but probably not a huge impact in the end, but I wanted to try it out. So then I inked the edges of the pattern paper, and now I'm doing more inking of edges. I picked out a number of embellishments, and I have already fussy cut off the white border on them. Sometimes I keep the white border, sometimes I don't. I think it's always best that it's there just in case I want it. But in this particular case, I decided that I was going to cut it off, and then I inked the edges. And as I always say, I think that creates just a little bit of contrast between the elements and whatever you place them over. So I always think that it's worth the effort of doing that. So I wanted to include some of these sunflowers in the wreath. I also wanted to include acorns. There's an acorn that says fall is in the air, and then there's another set of acorns, a big one and a little one. So I put those kind of opposite each other on the layout. Those do move around a little bit, as do the sunflowers. And actually, I move the sunflowers around even after I made the video, because when I took a picture of them, I didn't like the way the sunflowers were spaced. So you might notice on the final layout that the sunflowers look a little bit different, but that's just part of my process. So I have all of my elements laid out where I want them. I have the pumpkins surrounding the photo, as well as the title that says Feelin Gourd. I think that's so cute. So typical of Shimmerz Paint to come up with those cute little puns. I also included 2 die-cut leaves. I like those 2 red ones. I think that they just add a nice color to the layout. I think kind of completes it color-wise, although I do end up moving them around like everything else. And then I added some foam to a couple of the elements. I added foam to the pumpkin that's at the top of the photo, and also to all 3 of those die-cut sunflowers. And then I was pretty happy with where everything was placed, so I decided to go ahead and attach everything down. I love to use ATG adhesive. And then without going too crazy, I wanted to create a little cluster at the top of the photo. I already have the pumpkin there, and there are some leaves behind the pumpkin. So I added a small sunflower and then also a little branch that went to the left of the pumpkin. And then I wasn't sure if I was going to keep the stems on the leaves, but they were so thin and I didn't think they really added anything to the wreath. So I decided to go in and cut off all those little stems, and I think that that was the right choice. I think that the layout looked a little bit cleaner once all of those stems were removed. So at this point, I was thinking that the layout was almost done, so I was ready to add my white splatters. So I got out my little messy container of watered down white acrylic paint, and I began splattering the splatters all over the background, except of course on the photo, which I protected with a piece of paper. And I love the way the white splatters look. I think it added a nice kind of random looking element without going crazy and overboard. Oh, and then of course I had to add one of my favorite embellishments, which is photo corners. So I use one of the pattern papers and my photo corner punch, and I punched out 2 photo corners, and I punched out a whole bunch. I just couldn't get the look right, and then I finally figured out exactly how I wanted to position the paper punch. And I only had to cut out 2 corners because the other 2 corners are covered up by the pumpkins. And then I inked the edges and attached them down. So now I'm going in with some of the embellishments that were on the Studio Calico sticker sheet that was included in the kit. And these are these little stars, and they're just the right colors to go with the background, and I thought that it would add a nice touch and a different material to the layout. So I added whatever ones I didn't use on the other layout, I used on this layout. I really like those little embellishments. I think that it's those little details that really make a layout look better and more interesting. And then I also had these orange self-adhesive sequins, and so I decided to go ahead and add some of those to the layout as well. Again, just another little tiny touch that I think adds something to the layout, makes it look a little bit more detailed. So in my mind, I was thinking this layout is done. And then I got back home again, and I was thinking that I needed to add a few more things to it. So I was thinking that it would be nice to add some bare branches. I had a die that would cut them out. So I got a couple of my Shimmerz paints, and I took this same piece of paper that I used to stamp the leaves on, and I started painting it different colors of brown. So the first paint that I used was an Inklingz called Penny for Your Thoughts. And then I also used a Shimmerz called Fire and Brimstone. And now I'm adding some sprays of the November color Rose Gold Red, that's a Vibez, to this sheet of paper. And then I'm going to use it to die cut out a number of branches. And I really like the way there's a nice sheen to them. I think that even though the branches that I cut out are very small, you can still see that shimmer in those branches. And I definitely did not overthink making this piece of paper. I just wanted to include various shades of brown and brownish red so that the die cuts would look nice with the other elements on the page, but would be just a tiny bit darker. So I used those dies. You can see I have them down at the bottom of my mat. I don't know the manufacturer of them. And then I used some distress ink, once again my favorite vintage photo, and I inked the edges of all of them. And then in the process, I also inked my fingers quite a bit too. In addition to cutting out the branches, I also cut out some little berry branches in white. Those are to the right of my mat. I actually was going to use those first, and I didn't think about using the branches till a little bit later on. But I really liked the idea of the branches, so I'm trying those out first. I wasn't sure if I was actually going to include those little white berry branches, but I do end up using them. So once I'd scattered the brown branches all around the wreath, I used some Inklingz gel glue and I attached them down. And when I attach things like branches down, I don't put a whole lot of glue on them. I just put a little touch at the base, just in case later on, if I ever wanted to remove them, it would be easy to remove them without making a big tear in the layout. And I also like the way when they're only glued at the base, they lift up a little bit, and that gives just a slight bit of dimension to the layout. Well, that's my thought process. You could definitely put more glue on than I do, but that's how I like to glue them down. And then I still wasn't sold on these little white branches. I cut these out of a shimmer paper. It's not super shimmery. I just happened to have some bits of it around, enough to cut all of these out. So I decided that I would just make use of that paper. But I did end up deciding that I did want to include them. I thought that they were a nice way to break up the wreath. I do think that it's nice to have little touches of white, especially when you have white in other areas on the layout. So I'm tucking them into a whole bunch of different places on the layout, and they're not all cut from the same die. I have several of these dies. I bought tons of these unbranded branch dies years ago, and I still use them all the time. They're really handy, and I actually have cut back on using them. I used to use these on pretty much every layout. I feel like these are the kinds of things that you would see in a fall wreath, so I decided to go with them, and I'm glad that I did. I do think that it adds a nice finishing touch to this layout that I kept thinking was already finished. So I added some pearls to the two photo corners, and then I added some slightly smaller ones to the title. And then once again, I grabbed my Inklingz glue and I attached all of those little white branches down. And I actually ended up adding a lot of these little die cuts to the layout, but I got them all glued down, and now the layout is complete. And here are some close-ups. Thank you very, very much for watching this video. I really appreciate you watching it and then watching it all the way to the end. That's really awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed it and got some inspiration from it. If you're interested in purchasing the November Color Kitz collection, there's a link in the description box along with some other links to the Shimmerz website. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.